It was a pejorative, it's fair to say. The implication there is that it would have been better if it were more diverse, which meant more black people in it. So, firstly, I'd like to find out how she would do that. I mean, it would be kind of ludicrous to make Will and Kate's kids marry foreign dignitaries and get a color swatch out. I'm not particularly interested in breaking up the homogeneity of the family arbitrarily. Whoever they want to marry and have kids with is completely up to them. But of course, she wouldn't say the same thing to the Nigerian royal family, because if she were to turn around and say unbearably black, then that would obviously be very racist. And so I think people are objecting to it because I've just made that comparison there, and that would be hypocritical. But the thing is, it's not about hypocrisy, it's about hierarchy. It's about, unfortunately, with recent theories like critical race theory that we've seen imported from America, it categorizes people not as ethnicities or as cultures or as localities, but as races, white v black. And it posits that because of some hypothetical historical grievance that black people worldwide have suffered, therefore, they are impune from criticism because they are constantly under attack by white people. And so, therefore, they can say pretty much anything about any institution that features white people.
Nels Abbey, let's move away from Adjoa Andoh per se and broaden this, because I think something wider and deeper might be happening, Nels. Let's hear what you have to say.
Well, can I just to correct the gentleman on something that I think it speaks to the broader situation here. The gentleman said that you spoke about a Nigerian royal family. I just want to correct him. There's no such thing as a Nigerian royal family. Well, Nigeria is actually a colonial construct that was created by Britain, who went into this country, not into this country actually, went into that part of the world, and under the belief that they, as white people, with this ideology we call white supremacy, were more equipped and capable of running the affairs of the local people who lived there and lived amongst each other for hundreds of years. Sometimes they were even competing with each other, went to war with each other. So Britain inserted itself in there, gathered all these separate countries, nations, and kingdoms together, and created what is known as Nigeria, which was created for the purpose of creating profit for Britain. It was a business transaction. But I think in saying the actual point there also, it reveals something that history did not start last week. It did not start on Monday. History did not start, say, 10, 50 years ago, or according to the ridiculous article in The Spectator, it didn't even start when Martin Luther King was around. History in terms of race relations as we know them right now, which is a history of white supremacist dominance of predominant, well, principally African people, but of course other brown people, black and brown people across the world or so, and from the enslavement of them to the colonization of them to the actual continued subjugation of them. Also, this is an ideology that is buttressed and cuts across every single aspect of
But the
our
point
society.
I think Connor seems to be making, Nels, is that he's not interested in any of that. He feels that this is all being ginned up, it's hypothetical, and it's basically trying to guilt trip white people. It makes black people feel they can never be wrong. White people feel they must always apologize. And he and some of the other people who've expressed their frustration say they've had enough.
Yeah, well, I can see why people would feel like that. And I think part of it is because there's a lack of knowledge here, or there's either a lack of knowledge or there's some degree of bigotry, in my view. I can see why they would feel like that. Because look, if I was a white person, I heard the word. I've been there before. I grew up in the countryside of Britain. I grew up in the countryside. I was a foster child, and so I was the only black child in my school for a very, very long time, and I knew how vicious racism felt to me. So if I put myself if we came up with some idea of notional equality, that uttering the word white versus uttering the word black or so, as the article in Spectator seemed to suggest, that there was some sort of notion of equality in these sorts of things, then I could see why it would actually hurt. But to suggest there's some degree of notion of equality is a suggestion that, well, it reveals the fact that you probably don't know much of what you're talking about, or you don't have an understanding of history or even current affairs.
Connor, isn't what's really being revealed by all of this and the extraordinary reaction is that white British people, like white Americans, are not used to being, let me use a trendy term, othered, not used to their race being front and center. To be white is to be the default. So people don't talk about 4 white criminals. People talk about 3 black criminals, or the suspects were Asian men. So, for example, recently, when a number of white groomers, alleged paedophiles, came before the courts, nobody talked about their race. Same thing when it happened in Rochdale. Both of them happened in the same way. Again, nobody talked about their ethnicity. Whereas when it's predominantly Asian men, we talk about their ethnicity every single time.
I'd like to break down three things there.
Yep.
If I may have to do them in reverse order. First
Okay.
of all, the reason for the relevance in bringing up the ethnicity in the Pakistani, not Asian, because it wasn't Sikh men, it wasn't Chinese, it was Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs,
Yep.
is because they had a religious and ethnic motivation, calling the girls white, swear words that I'm not going to repeat,
Yep.
and they targeted them because of their race and their perceived religions. That was the relevance there, particularly because it was covered up for a very long time.
Uh-huh.
Now, to go on to the point about whiteness and
But
then
just a
colonial
point of
history.
correction. Just a point of correction. The reports actually found that the truth that a big part of what was actually happening here had a lot to do with their socio-economic status,
That's
as
not true at
opposed
all.
to
That
just
is not
say
true at all. From the
it
witness
is
testimonies, that's
100%
factually
true.
untrue. And I
It is
let you
actually
finish your point.
100%. They even said the authorities, the police, didn't even take them anywhere near as serious as they would because of their socio-economic status, as their statement. But please proceed, Colin. Sorry,
Go
sorry,
on.
to
Well, lots of
Connor.
them were
Sorry to
afraid of
interrupt
being
you.
accused of being racist, which buttresses my original point. But anyway, back onto the colonial history and whiteness point. I do find it again paradoxical that we've lumped in all of white Europeans and Americans into the category of whiteness, when particularly whiteness is an American ideological import because the melting pot melded together lots of European identities. But there's not really a white European identity, hence the fact that we've been at war, much like you said about the competing African nations for how many
Yep.
years. I don't feel much racial solidarity with a German, for example, because they think very differently to me. And then also the idea that okay, sure, we can get more specific about the pre-word Nigerian different African kingdoms, but I think the point stands actually that the British Empire going in to these countries like India, preventing bride burning, or going to Benin, for example, and disrupting the slave trade from King Gezo, whose exact quote was, "The slave trade is the lifeblood of my people. My mothers sing their kids to sleep at night with the song of an enemy reduced to slavery." The British Empire didn't just go in because they were racist. Lots of them went in on a moral crusade to end abhorrent things because the women of Britain, all very Christian, stitched a tapestry to Parliament to convince them to abolish the slave trade. There were elements of racism, of course, and they were always morally abhorrent, but there was also elements of moral elevation.
Yeah, so the point I was just making about what Connor said there also, throughout the whole situation, also throughout every last thing you're actually hearing there is, and Connor, I'm not calling you a racist in saying this. I, myself, as a black person in Britain, can be very white supremacist if I wanted to be. Actually, it's quite a profitable thing to be right now. But to understand the series of catalogue of arguments that you've offered or historical retelling of the situation is told exclusively from the prism of a, how can I describe it to you, from a white supremacist perspective or so, even in the most literal of terms, in terms of white supremacy, in terms of like, hey, Britain was a benevolent person or so, as opposed to actually look at the fact that the enslavement of Africans or so on the scale it actually became to the point where it became an actual trade, to the point where it went from being a punishment of war to a cause of potential war, so was pretty much Britain's hand playing a role in creating these civil disputes between these various kingdoms, nations, and empires. In order for them to survive, they had to take on these sorts of to get involved inside this in the slave trade or so. If they didn't or so, they risked themselves being conquered. So there's a lot more to his history. And I don't get me wrong, I'm not calling Connor any names whatsoever. I'm saying that Connor is like myself, prior to me getting a greater understanding of these things, is a subject of a white supremacist education system. And that doesn't mean it inherently means a racist education system, but it's one that always places a particular type of thinking on a pedestal and a particular type of thinking on the ground, as if, again, so if I asked him to say more things that a king of Benin has said, or say a king of Shikiri, or the Olu of Wari, or the Oba of Benin, or whatever the situation, all these different things might see, what you'll often find is that people such as Connor, so they probably can't say more than that one statement, or probably couldn't know much more than that, because it's become that talking point. It's become that talking point that's passed around, whether it's been in forums or newspapers or anything else. They know nothing else other than say about Africans, other than the fact that, hey, here's one select quote I can attribute to this king over here that benefits my white supremacist argument.
My white supremacist argument. Again, you don't get to do that underhanded thing of implying that I'm a racist. You don't get to do that. And the reason I brought that up, hang on, finish my point. The reason I brought that up is because I am not the one homogenizing into whiteness and blackness. I am saying there are different nations. There was obviously slavery between the African kingdoms before the British Empire showed up. I am saying we judge people as individuals. Adjoa did not judge people as individuals. She judged them as whiteness and blackness. You are saying that there is a white supremacist hegemony. I've just broken it down to different competing European nations and said I don't even agree with those traditions. I am saying that there are different national traditions, so we don't just do big palatial blocks. So No, I'm
But
not trying to advance white supremacy.
Connor, I speak German probably better than you. I
Yeah.
don't know,
Yeah,
unless you're going to
absolutely,
tell
yeah.
me. I can walk into a Munich bar, ask for ein Maß, which is like one of those huge pots of beer, in their local accent, and
Yes.
and you would walk in as an Englishman and probably ask for it in English. You'd get a better treatment than probably I would. Right? Now, what is that
And
based
well,
on?
I'm not going to accept that premise. Why would I
Okay.
accept that premise?
Okay. Why wouldn't you accept that premise?
Because why am I going to assume other people hate you because of your
No,
race?
no. I'm not saying they're going to hate me, but the treatment, the warmth with which they would greet you asking for your beer in English versus me asking for my beer in Bavarian German would depend on what they saw and how they would engage with me. And I'm suggesting to you from experience that would engage with you more warmly speaking English than me speaking German.
I think we actually enjoy other people partaking in each other's
yeah,
cultures, and
but
so I'm speaking from
it's-
experience when I say I wouldn't do that. So why would I
You-
presume that everyone else would treat you
I
differently?
can put it to you.
because of my experience. Go on.
I could put it to you. Well, Henry, I could put it to both of you in more stark terms. So, why is a Nigerian passport treated significantly inferior to, say, a German passport or an American passport, or even say, or for example, why is, say, a black Nigerian? Why would they struggle to get on, get in, and get up in British society than, say, a white South African would? This is not just. This is not just. These are facts. Are you with me? These are facts.
But what about
racialization-
in between racial, so intra-racial competition? Because we obviously in this country we lump Afro-Caribbean together. There are vastly disparate rates of success between West Africans.
No, we don't.
and
You might do,
Caribbean
but it's
folk.
African and African Caribbean. That's the term.
Yeah.
Two different groups.
Yeah, I agree. So what I'm
So,
saying
but
is, okay,
I want to- I
but
just want to
you're
put
saying
figures,
people
Connor. I
treat
want to
you
put- I
on
want-
your skin color. It wouldn't matter about so they're all lumped in together. What I'm saying is, if we separate out from skin color, okay, you're right. Fine. Let's take your premise of Nigerians would have a harder leg up. But compared to the people they share a skin color with, West African families, for example, do far better than Caribbean families. So it's not just a matter of race and disparate treatment based on race.
But also,
It's again cultural participation.
That's where white supremacist history comes into it once again. Look at what we call British Caribbean people are literally people who are descended from the horrors of enslavement at the hands of Britain and other imperialist powers who were exploited and commoditized and reduced to literal cattle. Are you with me? In order to create profit to Britain to make this country rich. So what you're seeing with the Nigerians or so, or the Africans, or the people who were not taken from the continent, some of them who were enslaved by Britain on the actual continent itself, their life experiences, their life differences, so the kind of cultures that are handed down by their parents and everything else. So it's very, very different to say people who've been ripped apart from everything, have lost even their names. They're still bearing the names of their enslavers till this very day. To the person I just finished speaking to, also, he bears a Scottish surname prior to me speaking to both of you right now. So these things over here, when we just say these things, that there's differences over here, yes, but look at what the big differences between these two different communities. And you'll once again see, you're going right back to the roots of white supremacy.